Hello, everyone. I'm Maria Ressa, and this is hashtag Hold the Line. Tonight, I'm really excited. The title comes from the way we draw lines for ourselves. Setting a line where on this side you're good, this side you're evil. Well, our guest tonight is somebody who took a very strong public opinion, she laid it out for all of us. She held the line. Frances Haugen, Facebook whistleblower. Frances, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
So, what made you decide? I mean, I know you've been asked this in different ways, but in retrospect, what made you decide, and was it the right thing to do?
I think there's a journey that every whistleblower goes on, which is you begin to get glimmers that something is wrong. You begin to assess whether or not change is possible within the system that you're in. You have to make a decision on whether or not you're willing to accept the costs of basically breaking with that system. And then the question is, what do you do then? And for me, when I joined Facebook, like I knew that Facebook had issues, right? Like I had watched it for years. I had a very, very close friend who had helped me relearn to walk after I was sick, who I lost to misinformation. Like they kind of spiraled in 2016 into some of the darker corners of the internet. And so I joined because like I never wanted anyone else to feel the pain that I had felt when I lost this person, right? Because he was like a younger brother to me, because we'd gone on this journey together. And but I got there, and one, I realized that I had been incredibly like US centric, right? Like I think a lot of people, the way they evaluate their own context is where they live. Like that's natural, that's human. There's nothing wrong with that. But I had entirely viewed the consequences of misinformation on Facebook in just my own personal, or maybe in the context of the United States. And I joined, and I didn't end up working on the US 2020 election, which is what I thought I was going to. I ended up working on misinformation everywhere else in the world. And it was a very rough, like, first 6 months, because I had never realized how devastating Facebook's choices were in other parts of the world, right? That in the United States, it may be, ruining our holidays because like we're now fighting with our uncles, but in other places in the world, people are dying. And not like a scattering of people. We're talking about mass like civil violence, like in places like Myanmar with the Rohingya, or what's evolving in Ethiopia. And I think the thing that allowed me to begin thinking more broadly about what could be done was that I watched over and over again very kind, conscientious people wake up to this truth inside of Facebook and then basically destroy themselves, right? That the lens that they were viewing the solution to the problem was, if I stay at Facebook and keep working, I know that progress is being made. If I leave Facebook, I know that one fewer person is working to make this problem better. And when I looked at it, I saw this as a problem of, are you privatizing the solution? Can individuals solve it? Or are you socializing the problem? Like, is this a thing that we as a society have to solve? And after watching this happen to a couple of people who I really, really respected, I saw that, I could stay and just grind myself into the ground. Or I could think about, was there a different path forward? And when they dissolved Civic Integrity, which was the team inside of Facebook that was responsible for the safety of society and making sure Facebook was a positive force in society, when they dissolved it, I came to the conclusion that they were not serious about solving this, and that on a pretty fundamental level, they couldn't even really see what the problem was. Like the higher levels of leadership couldn't, and that's when I realized I would have to do something. And so that's what's kind of led me here today. And I don't regret it at all. Like when I did it, like I often chafe a little when people like compliment me for my whistleblow, because like I felt like I did the minimum what I needed to do to be able to sleep at night. Right. That I did not want to wake up or I don't want to lay in bed in 20 years watching, another round of communal violence happen somewhere in the world. and know that I hadn't done what I could have done. You know, but and so that's why I did what I did. I knew that I knew that I was one of the few people in the world that had this as a specialty, right? Like I haven't worked on one social network. I've worked on 4 social networks. I haven't just worked on social networks. I worked on literally like the guts of social networks. Like how is the content chosen and how is it prioritized? And so I felt that I had a duty to do something. And so that's why I did what I did.
It seemed for a while that you were really at the edge of a tipping point, that you had bipartisan support, you know, especially on the at least in the US on the impact on teenage girls. But nothing concrete has happened yet. I mean, has enough been done?
So it's so fascinating to me. Like I often hear this, right? Like people are like, oh, we almost had something and then we lost it. And the thing I keep trying to remind people is the wheels of change move slowly, right? And we are actually, we weren't at a tipping point in October. Like we're at a tipping point right now, right? Like Europe is about to pass, hopefully, the Digital Services Act. The UK is about to pass the online safety bill. The thing I keep reminding people is Facebook can't really operate in a locality-based way. Like if 100 million people, so the country, like people who make up countries that make up like 100 million people, if they get together and they pass a consortium approach, Facebook basically has to move the floor up. And we saw this with the UK's children's rights bill last summer, where like as soon as that went into effect, Facebook passed a bunch of things that changed advertising for children, for example. And the UK is only 65 million people, right? And so we are in a very exciting place right now. And so I want people to remember, you know, passing laws is not sexy, but it is churning along.
So you have said a lot about this, but define for us again the problem today and how we should be solving it.
What I see as the problem with Facebook is actually about our relationship with Facebook. And usually when people talk about your relationship with social media, or excuse me, I should say Meta, because they have this wonderful new name. When we think about our relationship with Meta, social media, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, we shouldn't be thinking about it in terms of, or we can think about it in terms of how many hours a day do I want to spend on my phone? Or like, am I using this compulsively? That's a great question to ask. But there's a higher level question, which we are never encouraged to ask, which is when we raise a concern with Facebook, does Facebook have a duty to respond? And up until now, the relationship that Facebook has framed for us is very, very one-sided. They are this monolith. They impact society. They're isolated. They do whatever they want. And when we raise concerns, they say, "Oh, I see that you have some examples, but those are anecdotal. It's not real. It's not really a pattern." And the reality is that the thing that changed when I brought forward my evidence was it showed that, yes, activists had raised many of these concerns before. These were not new issues. But now there was proof that Facebook knew these things were real and that Facebook had basically been lying to the public. And I think we need to take that knowledge now and say, how can we force Facebook to have a different relationship with the public? And that might be via legislative means, like there's a lot going on with the DSA, the online safety bill. But it might also mean things like, how do we as people organize? How do young people organize? You know, there's a saying, people only change when the costs of changing are less than the costs of staying the same. And there's a lot of different meanings of cost, right? Those costs might be things like they're having trouble getting employees. It might be things like advertisers are boycotting them. It might be things like we are literally blocking the buses that they commute on as they go into the office. All these things are ways that we can increase the cost of them not changing. And until that relationship changes, as long as they are allowed to operate in the dark, they're going to choose over and over again, like when they face these little conflicts of interest of like, could we make the platform safer or could we make a little bit more money? As long as they can operate behind a curtain, things will continue to get worse. Until the incentives change, we should not expect Facebook's behavior to change.
the tremendous power of Facebook, of social media in general, is now felt. It's like a corrosive um, rot that is slowly seeping into everything that we do. I guess just yesterday, Russia invaded the Ukraine. And again, something that was brought to Facebook in 2014, so 8 years ago, Russian disinformation in the US presidential elections in 2016, the kind of the split, the tearing apart of American identity, hitting both sides of Black Lives Matter. I mean, these are all things that we have seen. Yet everything happens with impunity in the absence of the law. And I'll come back to some of the things you said. In the absence of the law, can people do anything right now? Like Crimea. Crimea was annexed. Now Russia's invaded. And part of the biggest problem right now is, how do you get reliable information in the middle of this war when you have, as some of the journalists are saying, fake films, that when you're being manipulated by power at scale, using these social media platforms. Yes.
So part of what makes it so difficult, right, is you see these, I've heard the phrase before, like, what is the information digestion cycle, right? So information does not come from a void. It comes from raw little facts, people's observations, and things percolate up. And the strategy that the strategy that Russia has used quite successfully since maybe even before 2014 is that they understand. Oh, sorry.
It's morning. It's morning.
It's earlier. Yeah, it's morning
yes,
where I am.
Thank you for
this is how I'm opening my day. And it's a Friday. Fridays. Ooh. But they think about the whole information digestion cycle, right? So they do things like they plant, bloggers who begin to have these like raw facts. They make artificial news sources that then synthesize those facts, and it allows you to give kind of a chronology or like a history, a genealogy to these facts. It makes them look a lot more plausible, right? It's not like something popped out of the void into this news source. They can say, oh, look, there's all this like little bits that support it. And it's really, really important for us to think about, how do we reclaim our information networks? Like, I think a lot of the work that you're doing is really, really interesting, because we have to come together as coalitions and say, like, do we want to exist, right? Because if we don't have our own ability to establish truth in a way that we trust, we don't have a way to move forward. And so I think it's one of these things where we have to act proactively, because places like Russia are acting proactively. They plan for years on how they're going to insert this information, how they're going to amplify it up. And unless we think about how do we in our individual communities think about how do we control information, or have sources that we trust, I don't think we have a good path forward.
The Philippines today celebrates the 36th anniversary of People Power, which really, that in 1986 helped spread, this movement of democracy all around the world. And yet, on the 36th anniversary, another Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son, is poised to take over the presidency. He's fighting again a widow. So it's almost like Back to the Future for us. And what we have seen, really, right? Marcos versus widow, and then, I guess we watched this. We watched our history be changed in front of our eyes. How we're also walking into these elections. How can we have integrity of elections if we don't have integrity of facts?
Totally.
How can we take this seriously?
So I think this is one of those things where, I think of like, what is my personal mission? Like, what am I doing every day? Why do I wake up? And my personal mission is all about helping remind people of their own agency, right? That we are entering an interesting period of history, right? I think around the world, a lot of people are scared about what are we about to face.
Yeah.
And I think it's very easy to give in to fatalism, right? Like I coach people a lot about like, what is the seductive power of fatalism? Because fatalism says you are not responsible, right? Like the system is too big, it's too crushing, there's no hope, right? And so it's really seductive because now you don't have responsibility. And I think the thing that I always try to remind people is that no matter what happens to you, there are these little circles of agency that you have, right? And those circles of agency also relate to our circles of truth or information, right? So on the most basic level, no matter what is coming in at you from people in your life, from the media, the first most important circle of truth, the most important circle of agency is to remember that you have value, right? It doesn't matter who you are, you have value, you have dignity, you intrinsically, doesn't matter what's happening around you, what you've done in your past, anything, you matter, right? Start from that. Just start from that. Doesn't matter. Just start from that circle and cultivate that, saying, I matter, I exist, I have dignity, I am a human. And then the next circle is care for yourself, right? Protect yourself, seek out what you can trust, and then begin caring for others. And that next circle, there's another circle of truth, which is making sure others have access to information that they can trust, you can trust. Because we gain power as we gain these networks, right? And they can be very small, right? You can start with a group chat that's just some of your friends and you're trying to digest what are you seeing? Because the thing about misinformation is it's very seductive, right? It feels good. I was at a dinner a couple of days ago, and we were discussing the idea that fake facts are focus group tested, right? That they can go and they can send out 100 different kind of weird facts or weird stories into a giant Facebook group, and some of those will get traction and some won't. And the space of false truth is infinitely larger than real truth. Real truth is complicated, it's nuanced, it may feel bad. But fake truth, the things that are the most satisfying will get the most reach. And so as you think about that, so, you care for yourself, care for those around you, care for a larger community. Similarly, think about what is the information ecosystem for yourself, those around you, your larger community, because that's how we resist these systems, which are trying to steal truth from us and try to make us believe that we have no power.
The irony, of course, is that normally to bring all of this together, a great information ecosystem would be the way you would build community, right? But our information ecosystem is corrupt. Shoshana Zuboff wrote this like 750-page book, and she basically says she lumps them all together to the business model, surveillance capitalism. And she said it's essentially saying all of these content moderation, user privacy, safety, and antitrust, that all of these issues are identical and you have to just get rid of the business model. What do you think of that?
I'm not an economist and I'm not a political theorist. I think the ideas around I always work from the present, right? So you have the ability to sketch out these worlds where you're like, this platonic world exists or could exist. And I think there's this interesting question of like, what is the path between our present world and any given hypothetical world? And my understanding is Shoshana's position is that the systems that we exist with today, so that might be Google, it might be Facebook, it might be Instagram, TikTok, whatever the system is. My understanding is her position is these systems shouldn't exist, right? They should have been illegal at the beginning, like they violated the law. They shouldn't exist today. And I think that is a very important position because it gives a sense of moral purity. But we need to always ask ourselves, like, what is the path from where we are today? Like, yes, a whole bunch of things happened where, I'm not a legal theorist, so I can't assess the validity of that argument. But at the same time, there's this question of where do we go from today? And I think it's important for people to recognize that if we turned off Facebook today, the magnitude of that impact. So I live in the United States. We have, Facebook has eaten a lot of the internet, but has not eaten the totality of the internet. A lot of places in the world, because Facebook paid people to use Facebook versus use the free and open internet. If you were to flip the switch and turn off Facebook, the internet would end for, I don't know, at least 1 billion people in the world. right? And so I think it's important for us to think about, it's a question of what is our path to a better future from where we stand today.
Right.
And so I do 100% agree that the business model is the problem, right? That as long as Facebook doesn't have any accountability, they know that they're the only ones that can see behind the curtain. As long as they know that they can tell us whatever they want to, and we just have to believe it, because they've done this move, right? So there was a very large protest, I guess it's 18 months ago, like Stop Hate for Profit in the United States, where a lot of advertisers boycotted because of Facebook's negligence with regard to things like hate speech. And Facebook came out and just said, oh, we fixed it. And so one of the big things I want to work on in the next, 12 to 24 months is, unless we have the ability to have information that is controlled by the people, controlled by the public, where we can see what's going on Facebook and we can independently validate these things. Until we have that, we can't actually resist Facebook, right? And so that's one of the big paths forward. And so I want to start this thing I call open source integrity. That is in that vein.
That's fantastic. So how do we get to this point where you can do that and effectively scale it at the level of Facebook?
And so I think there's steps. It's like, one is we need to establish systems that are open source, that are controlled by the public, that are transparent, where we have our own source of truth, where we can say this is how Facebook actually operates in places around the world. I think the second step is, once we have that basis where we can define truth instead of relying on Facebook to tell us what is real. And if you ever want a good laugh, go look at their transparency center. They selectively use, I want to start a YouTube channel called Dancing with Data, where we show people lie with numbers. And wow, the Transparency Center is an example of that. But the second step is, once we have our own ability to say, yes, the sky is blue, then we start to organize, or we can do these things even in parallel, right? And so I'm starting to do college visits really soon. Like next week is our first college visit. And we're going to start talking to students about what are the levers of change? We have the ability to put pressure on these systems. And it's amazing when I talk to students, I'm like, hey, we can go after the business model. We can go after the financial incentives. We can go even after executives, right? Imagine if there was a dance party outside the home of every executive above a certain level at Facebook. At some point, they'd be like, maybe we should do something different, because I really like peace and quiet. Because like they say, no justice, no peace. And I think one of the things that is missing from the education of a lot of students, for obvious reasons, is they don't understand the history of resistance, right? I was reading your Wikipedia page, and one of the things I found really interesting was you have some history in political theater, right? And I really believe there's this interesting opportunity to, at a larger scale, remind young people of the power of political theater, right? That we can begin to demand and live a different truth. And in the process of that, we can actually change the world. And so I don't know. My job is to remind people that they are not powerless. There are many levers that exist.
That's actually a message we need to hear now, because we've heard. I guess let me close this so that we can also keep talking. But in terms of, I just want to pull out last two questions. Mm-hmm. The last one is, from all of the documents that you put out, it was clear that the worst filtered to the global south, to countries like ours.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How was it allowed to continue for as long as it did, and to continue until today? How does it happen with impunity? Yeah. How can it continue with impunity when it's clear what has happened? And you've released these documents.
Yeah. So what's shocking to me is Facebook's response to my actions was to lock down all the security information inside the company so that only employees that worked on security could see it. And people pointed out inside the company, hey, this would not have stopped Frances because she was in security, right? She would have still gotten access to all of these. The only people that have been denied access to the truth are people who work on the product itself. Isn't that amazing?
That's horrific.
And so I think it's this question of, Facebook has had selective pressure inside the company for a very long time. where people who were willing to toe the line, like literally this has been, other people have disclosed this before me. This was not in my disclosure. People have sent out posts that executives have said, which say things like, the only thing that matters is connecting people. If some people die, or not even if some people die, people will die, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because this is such a sacred calling, right? And I think a secondary thing is that, I think inside the company, people view this as a black and white issue, and they try to frame it as a black and white issue outside the company, which is the idea that there's not a range of options. It's either the status quo or some nebulous bad thing. And the reality is, Facebook's own documents say there are simple solutions that don't involve censorship. It's things like, should you have to click on a link before you reshare it? Right? Twitter does this.
Yeah.
It's not that expensive. It's like, it's a fraction of a percentage point of profit, but it reduces misinformation by like 10%. And it probably reduces it even more in the global South, because Facebook has not invested in third-party fact checking for the global South. And I think there's some simple things we can demand, like something as simple as, if Facebook had to publish publicly every week, what were the top 100 posts viewed in every country in the world? Yeah. Right? It's really simple. Like, I don't think anyone's privacy is violated by that. If all those posts have been viewed by 1 million people, 500,000 people, has anyone's privacy really been violated? I don't think so. But if we could just see that, I think we would all be outraged. Because in the global South, in some of the most fragile places in the world, all 100 of those posts are going to be horrific. And I think just being able to stand in that, just being able to stand in that truth, it would demand a lot more.
So, and this goes to the last question. I mean, there are groups that have used CrowdTangle, for example, to look at the top 10 in America. Again, more focused there. We live this, and we know how horrific it is, right? And yet, and as we walk into elections, there's still it does make you feel helpless. I guess the last question for you is, if you're in a situation where you're walking into your elections, you've talked about agency, you've talked about civic engagement. I guess, what would you do to help these algorithms turn good rather than evil? Is there anything that we can do aside from what we're doing now?
Changing these systems.
Yeah.
So we can, this is one of these challenges. So part of why I always try to like pull people back to, what do you actually have control over, right? Because there are changes we need to make to Facebook. There are changes we need to make around the incentives for Facebook. Those things exist. There are options. But the reality is that we, like you said, we're not going to do these things before the elections of 2022, right? There's a whole bunch of elections coming. And I have disagreements with certain other people who work in the like social media reform space, because they frame it as, the only things we can do are ones that we have to fix it before this fall, because if we don't do it before the midterm elections, the US will fall into civil war. And I think making it that catastrophic is really counterproductive, right? That I'm actually, I may seem sunny, but I am actually a dour Scandinavian, right? I'm like, well, let's say we do fall to totalitarianism. What will we do next? And I think sometimes looking at it that way and saying, let's say worst case scenario happens, how do we respond? And the part of why I'm always trying to remind people of, you have these circles of control and influence.
Yeah.
Is that no matter what happens, no matter what happens in the ballot box, you will continue to have those circles of control and influence. And the nature of history is that sometimes this takes decades, but even when the circle turns down, it eventually turns back up. And the way it turns back up is by starting with those individual nodes of control, and then scaffolding bigger and bigger and bigger. And maybe your initial circle of like influence and control is only 3 or 4 people, but 3 or 4 people can be another 3 or 4 people. And the most important thing is for us as individuals to remember democracy, to matter that we each matter. We matter both to ourselves and to each other, because that's how people power continues to exist no matter what happens on this specific turn of the wheel. And so that's like the thing I always am trying to seed in people, because no matter what happens next, if we remember that, it will keep us going. Oh no, I've lost them. My internet broke.
Mine just dropped completely. I think
mine
I'm
just
back.
dropped.
I'm back.
Yeah,
Did you just drop?
Yeah.
Wow, that was insane. Okay, so I just heard you talk about, that this is where people power is. So essentially, you're reminding us of go back to our humanity, go back to reclaiming that power.
It's not even a question of go back to. I just want to remind people that like anxiety can paralyze us. Right, we can see this colossal thing. We can see the wave bearing down on us, right? And I think the most important thing to remember when like we see the wave bearing down on us, it's very easy to be like, this is outside of my control. It is too big. It's going to win. And the thing I just want to remind people is like, if we look at the history of colossal oppressive forces, so this is Soviet Union, this is the Nazis in France, this is the British in India, right?
Yeah.
The way we get out of any situation is we first remember that we each matter and we matter to each other. And so like if we remember that we'll always have that scaffold, that's how we will dig our way out of whatever happens next. And I think just that can give us the energy to fight now, because it allows us to not give in to fatalism.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. Frances Haugen, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.